Hey, so this is the first of the actual sort of lit related videos. What I'm going to do in this video, so what I'll do every week is give you guys a sort of overview video, and then I'll give you three videos focused specifically on pieces of literature that we're reading that week. So this video is going to be the overview of the Romantics. Again, this would be Volume D of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. So what I'll do fairly briefly, because I don't want this video to be terribly long, so I'll talk over a couple of big political trends, a couple of cultural shifts, a couple of literary shifts and things like that we see during the Romantic period, and then with all three of the historical periods, we're looking at what I like to do with survey courses is give you guys three big trends that shape this era and that are really important and that we're going to see reflected in the literature that we're reading. So as we sort of find out at the beginning of the critical introduction to this anthology, there is a lot of debate about when the Romantic period begins. Some people identify it at 1775, 76, which is when the American Revolution begins. Some people identify it as late as about 1798, which is when Coleridge and Wordsworth published Lyrical Ballads, which is sort of the great masterpiece of the early part of the Romantic era. But I think the most common sort of start date for the Romantics is 1789, when the French Revolution begins. And so the early part of the Romantic period politically coincides with what's called the Age of Revolutions. So we have the American Revolution from 1775, roughly 1776, up through 1783, founded on these sort of ideals of liberty and freedom. We have the French Revolution, which begins in 1789 with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the storming of the Bastille and things like this, and goes up in one form or another up through the late 1790s, at which point we sort of get Napoleon in and we go to Imperial France. But again, French Revolution, very, very concerned about liberty, equality, and fraternity, which was the tripart motto of the French Revolution. And then we get the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s, where a French colony on the island of Haiti declares its independence, and it's this sort of great and glorious struggle. And then actually, sort of later on, we get a series of smaller revolutions, less ideologically important revolutions. One of the ones that sort of captures people's attention or captures the imagination of the British is actually the Greek War for Independence. And Byron, George Gordon, Lord Byron, one of the greatest of the Romantic poets, raises a regiment and goes to Greece to actually help fight for their freedom, and he dies there. Not in battle, he dies of dysentery, so, you know, that sucks in an Oregon Trail kind of way. But this is the Age of Revolutions, and so part of what that means, actually this is connected to a lot of the big trends that I'm going to tell us about later. So the Age of Revolutions opens up a lot of political possibilities because it's about freedom, and it's about individualism, and it's about sort of shrugging off these chains of oppression in autocratic states, absolute monarchies, and very conservative, sort of hierarchical religions. The flip side of this is that you have a major anti-revolutionary movement. So, in Britain, in Prussia, in Spain, in these other sort of countries that are not experiencing their own revolutions, you tend to have a very repressive political system. So this was, the Romantic era was also an era where, so in Britain, official censorship ended in 1695, when the last of censorship laws lapsed and Parliament didn't renew them. During this era, because there were so many concerns about political revolutions from France and the United States spilling over into Britain, there were a lot of attempts to figure out ways of censoring what was being printed and what was being read without officially doing it, because Britain by this point had a grand sort of tradition of freedom of the press, which had been theorized by philosophers like David Hume as one of the central sort of components of British political identity. So they couldn't really just say, no, you can't publish things. They had to figure out a way of using things like taxes and using things like sedition laws to sort of weed out some of the more politically dangerous stuff. So politically you have this sort of weird blend of revolutionary freedom, revolutionary fervor, and political sort of control that's being exerted. Broadly speaking, we have sort of two reigning monarchs during this era. We have George III, who is, of course, well known to Americans as the guy who loses the Revolutionary War. He was not a terrible British king early on, and then about 1800 he starts going mad, and everybody's like, as you do when you have a mad monarch running the country. And so by about 1810 to 1811, like, he's really bad off, and so we have what's called the Regency period, which is early 1800s, where Prince George, who was this initially very dashing, sort of hedonistic playboy kind of figure, but later on this very sort of overweight, gouty, lecherous, not particularly, I imagine, fun to be around kind of dude. So he's basically running the country, and then he later on becomes George IV. So these are the two sort of monarchs. We have this sort of crazy monarch who just is literally like so insane that they had to take power away from him, and then we have this sort of fat, lecherous playboy, which is really, like, just sort of beautifully representative of the Romantic period, I think. So what makes the Romantic period romantic is that they have this return to medieval literature, or what would be called Gothic literature during this period. So the medieval romance is rescued. Immediately preceding this, throughout the 18th century, you had what was called the Neoclassical period. So, as in the Renaissance, people were very, very interested in Greek culture, Roman culture, the idea of the ancients and stuff like this. And so medieval literature, medieval culture, folklore, and things like this really get sort of shunted off as not being terribly interesting. And then in the late 1700s, scholars start to go back to medieval literature and say, this is crazy stuff. This is fantastic. Like, we've got, like, you take something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, for instance. Like, you've got a dude who cuts off another guy's head, and the guy picks his head up and rides off. This is fantastic. This is all about sort of the freedom of the imagination and possibilities and things like this. So they become, writers of this period, especially poets, become very interested in these Gothic stories of the supernatural and the imagination and this sort of freedom of experiencing the world in a way that's not tied down to rationality, and that's not tied down to empiricism. It's not tied down to, we can look at the world and see that it operates in these certain ways. which really guided sort of the neoclassicals and the Enlightenment era. So, so what we have in terms of Romantic aesthetics, we have this sort of expansion of the role of the imagination, desires for freedom, and what we call the Gothic, which is this return, again, to often a very dark, sort of quasi-medieval focus. So this sort of overall summary of the Romantics politically, and actually, if you take a look inside the book itself, actually, we have here at page 240 or at page 546, we have a series of sort of insets of paintings and things like that. And some of these actually give you a really good sense of what the Romantic era is all about. So like you take a look at, for instance, Goredale's Scar by James Ward, and I'll show you this in here, but you should look at it in your own books. So this painting, for instance, gives us a really good sort of sense of what the Romantics are all about, or A Philosopher in a Moonlit Churchyard by Philippe de Loutherbourg. I don't know French, but like, so we've got this idea of very sort of dark settings, very medieval settings. They loved ruins, so like ruined churches. Tintern Abbey, for instance, becomes the inspiration for one of Wordsworth's most famous poems. And Tintern Abbey is in Wales, and it's sort of it's a crumbling ruin, really beautiful. But like, this becomes what the Romantics are fascinated by, and like nature overcoming churches, castles, things like this. These sort of symbols of decaying medievalism become really sort of iconic and beloved of the Romantics. So in literary terms, this is the great era of poetry. Like, some of the best poetry in the history of British literature is produced during this era. Partially because we have a major shift in what's involved in being a poet. So again, like, 18th century is really guided by neoclassicism. People like Alexander Pope are coming up with a lot of rules, and they're saying the best way to write poetry is to do the things that the ancients did, and to sort of do them really skillfully. Whereas once you get to people like Wordsworth and Keats and Southey and people like this, who are the sort of key figures of Romanticism, they're saying, no, it's not about rules, it's about experiencing a sort of transcendental or sublime feeling, and trying to put that on paper. So the idea in terms of poetry becomes a lot more about emotion. It becomes about the poet's emotion and experience of the world, as opposed to sort of following rules and using the ancients as a guideline. So, and then other big trends that I'll talk about before I get to the three sort of big things I want you to focus on. One thing that's happening during this period is we have an increasing number of women writers. Like, more women are writing in this period and getting published in this period than ever before. So people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who will read excerpts from The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She is a major thinker. Like, she's influencing aesthetics, she's influencing politics, she's influencing early feminism, and so on and so on. Super important. Jane Austen, one of the greatest novelists of this era, probably Jane Austen and Sir Walter Scott are the two sort of big Romantic era novelists. Austen is one of the best writers in the history of English. I mean, she's fantastically witty, she's satirical, and she's very clever about the way that she presents social relations. Maria Edgeworth is another sort of great novelist of this period. Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein, which is one of the sort of great Gothic horror classics. So we have an increased amount of women writing, and we have an increased amount of people writing in general. This is an era where literature, poetry becomes much more prevalent. So newspapers are printing poetry. There's an increasing number of magazines and things like this. And by the late Romantic period, probably about 50% of the English population was literate, which was a massive increase in the amount of literacy in Britain. Like, I mean, a century before, it was way lower. So you've got a ton of people who are reading and who are starting to identify themselves as readers. And what this means is, first off, that we get a ton more writing from this period. Like, this is a fairly short period as identifiable literary historical periods go. This is only maybe 60 years. So this is a fairly short period. There's a ton of writing. There's a ton of great work coming out during this era. But there's also a lot of concerns at this time about declining standards of aesthetics, declining standards of the arts, of poetry, and things like this. Let's see, what else is important? So I'm a theater guy. That's primarily what I work on. Theatrically, this is not a very interesting time. Like, there's vibrant theater traditions, but a lot of it is melodrama and a lot of it is spectacle. So we're not going to get really good drama until sort of the late Victorians, the 1880s, 1890s, when we get people like George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde writing. So I think those are the sort of big trends. Also, the other one I wanted to mention, I remember now, the other sort of thing that's important to note about this period, politically, socially, in terms of context, is that we have a lot of pushes for increased political participation among working class people. In the 1780s, 1790s, British politics is still very much dominated by the aristocracy. And part of the problem that you get really up through the 1820s, so Napoleon is defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, and so that's the end of sort of revolutionary France, like dead stop there. But part of the problem that a lot of these movements had, including anti-slavery movements, including early women's rights movements and things like this, but especially workers' rights movements, one of the problems was that any push for reform, any push for expanded rights or things like this, was regarded as akin to revolutionary activity. So there were attempts at parliamentary reform bills and things like this, but none of them took off until 1832, when Parliament actually passed a reform bill that redistricted Britain, and that gave an increased number of workers the right to vote for parliamentary representatives. And that actually marks the end of the Romantic era, when we move on to the Victorian era, although Victoria doesn't come to the throne until 1837. But 1832 and the Parliamentary Reform Bill really sort of is a nice transition point for moving on. Anyway, so if you have questions about this period, please sort of put them into the discussion forums, or, again, like reading the critical introduction to the Norton Anthology is a great thing to do. But I want to give you guys 3 big trends that really shape the Romantic era, and that we're going to see reflected in the literature that we're reading. So the first is that neoclassical formalism is replaced by the political possibilities of revolution and the aesthetic and literary possibilities of the medieval romance. So what this means is that rather than being an era guided by rules and guided by sort of formal approaches, tried and true approaches, this becomes an era interested in freedom and interested in imagination. Like imagination, the passions become really sort of supreme in this era. The second big trend that I want to talk about is that this is the era of individual feeling. So this, again, sort of connects very closely with the first one. But again, the notion of poetry changes during this era, and it becomes about trying to represent the poet's emotional response to the world around them. So you go to Tintern Abbey and you sort of have this experience of the sublime, and you try and put that down on paper, and that becomes the goal of poetry. And this is often prompted by observing nature. So Keats's Ode on a Nightingale, for instance, or I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by Wordsworth. These sort of poems that draw very heavily on nature are actually less about nature as an external thing than about the poet's internal emotional experience of observing nature, of being in nature, and of feeling this sort of connection with the sublime represented by nature. And then third and finally, this is an era that valorizes the quest for the impossible. So poets are seeking the sublime, and I've used that term a couple of times, and very basically the sublime is supreme beauty tied to pain. So the sublime is semi-divine, the sublime is a sort of perfection, it's this sort of natural or artless, sort of, I don't know, fantastic experience, but there's also a sort of component of painful incompleteness or of painful isolation to this. So this, the paradox of the sublime, perhaps, is that it makes you feel simultaneously connected with everything else in existence and totally isolated. And so we get this both in a very sort of direct sense in the nature poetry, in the paintings of nature and things like this that abound during this period. We also get this in a focus on heroes who quest for the impossible. And this is sort of the hallmark of Byron's poetry, heroes who seek things that cannot be achieved. So those are our 3 big trends that we're going to see across the Romantics. We'll see those, obviously, with sort of varying emphases, depending on what you choose to read in week 2, the Choose Your Own Adventure era. But in week 1, this week, you should see these ideas at work, influencing the poets that we're reading and influencing Wollstonecraft's political writing, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and also Keats's letter on negative capability. So that's the Romantics. If there's anything you want to know more about, post questions and I will attempt to answer them, or we can discuss them as a class. Thanks.